Hi everyone, I'm thriller author j.f.penn and today I'm here with Rebecca Cantrell. Hi Becky.
Hi.
Hello again. So just as a little introduction, Rebecca is the New York Times bestselling author of the Order of the Sanguines series with James Rollins, as well as the Joe Tesla series and the Hannah Vogel mysteries. And today we're talking about vampires. We should
Tonight
be wearing, we should be gone goth makeup. That would have been quite fun.
we should have, yeah, we should have coordinated that better.
Oh well, next time when I see you in person, we'll get the black out. But just interestingly, because you've got the Sanguine series, which we'll go into more, but it's definitely vampiric, and you also wrote I Dracula as Becca Black. And so, what is your fascination with vampires?
I think that goes back a long time. I read vampire stuff when I was a kid. I like the vampire movies. And I think there's something about this idea that you can live forever, but at the cost. And what does that cost? And what does it mean? And I think Anne Rice, I read her stuff when I was a teenager, and she really addresses those issues and was the first one that I read who really profoundly addresses that you're a monster. It's not your fault. What do you do next? And that has always fascinated me because some people, I remember having, arguments with friends, and many of them were like, just kill bad people, problem solved. And I was thinking, well, even if you could know they were bad people, you're still a serial killer like Dexter, on a certain level. And yet I do sympathize with Dexter, but he's a monster. And, if you, being Dexter would be very, very difficult, especially if you were someone who, like hopefully most people, is not a natural born killer or a killer that was made at a young age.
Yeah. Oh no, that's interesting. So there, it's like not a straight good evil. It's more that line, I guess. The grey area between good and evil. I mean, but do you think that's well, the question is really why are humans so fascinated with vampires? Because the legends have been going for thousands years, more than that.
And they're everywhere. On every continent, there's creatures that suck blood and get some kind of power out of it. So it's not that it's a Western legend or a legend in one part of the world. They're like dragons. They're everywhere.
And Anne Rice famously, I think, said that in terms of the trends for books, she's seen the vampire trend come around 3 times in her career, which is interesting. Again, I mean, it's not a fad, is it?
No, it comes and goes, and it seems to come and go during times of economic trouble. So if you look at the famous movie vampire started out in the 30s when there was Nosferatu, and the movies that came out afterwards with Bela Lugosi and Frankenstein, that kind of horror was popular in the 30s. And then Anne Rice, of course, was popular in the 80s when there was the big economic crisis. And then we've seen vampires come back as the economy has kind of gone south in the last few years. So I wonder if there's something about, I don't know, being financially insecure where you start to think that your life essence is in fact being sucked out of you. And
Or
what
that it's
reality out of it.
yeah, or maybe it's just that people want escapism when things are bad, and hopefully vampires are kind of escapism, aren't they?
Well, one hopes that they're not actually real.
Which is funny. Yeah, so it's interesting because, I mean, talking about sort of current things, we've had The Strain on TV and the book by Guillermo del Toro and Chuck Hogan. And really interesting, they use the term Strigoi, which you use and has also kind of come from legend. So I wondered if you could maybe explain a bit about the Strigoi and the legends around vampires.
Well, the strigoi is a Romanian term for what we would call a vampire. And one of the things we wanted to do was bring back this more traditional notion of vampires as monsters, vampires who have hidden secrets and who do evil. Because if you look at, like, Twilight is a very good example, and True Blood too, there's no cost for being a vampire. You have immortality and you have eternal youth and you have strength and all these other powers. And if you look at Twilight, the only downside is you sparkle. And that's it. They don't have to kill humans. They can live on animal blood. There's really no downside. So why wouldn't he want to make her a vampire? Why wouldn't anyone want to be a vampire in that world? Because they're beautiful, they're rich, they're successful, they're immortal, and they're not even evil. And so one of the things that Jim and I talked about a lot at the beginning was how to make it clear that there is a cost, that there has to be some kind of a trade-off, that when you walk in darkness and you accept, or this pact is thrust upon you, where you can only survive by committing a very evil act, killing another human being, then what does that do to someone, and what does it do to them across time? What does it do to their, for lack of a better word, for their soul? And so we kind of were careful when we were creating that creature, that we made them dark enough and strong enough, but also weak enough. So, they had to be able to be killed, but they had to be difficult to kill. They had to be able to survive on the blood of Christ, but it had to come at a personal and physical cost. So there were all these trade-offs that we kind of kept coming back to make sure that there was always a price. We argued about animal blood off and on for years. Because I felt that they couldn't drink animal blood. If they could drink animal blood, then that was just a cop-out. And any priest who didn't do that was, or any vampire who didn't do that, or Strigoi who didn't do that, was just choosing to do evil. And one of the interesting things for me about being a vampire is a lot of the time is you don't choose it. It's thrust upon you. Rune Corza didn't choose to be a vampire. And in fact, in the whole series, I don't think there's anyone except for Elizabeth Bathory who chose that life, knowing what it was. And so that's important, because you have the corruption of the innocent. I mean, Rune was a good man. He was a priest. He was not evil before this happened, and he needed to try to figure out how he could continue without losing his soul and becoming evil. And if he could just go off and drink cow blood, like any other priest could do by eating a steak, then it didn't have a cost. So we went back and forth, and we had to come up with some very complicated stuff when we had Piers, who was this Strigoi or Sanguines, who was trapped underground for a very long time. And we had just, most of it didn't make it in the book, but we had these very complicated discussions as to how he could have survived.
over a very long time. We'll come back to that long life. But in terms of how much you took from, I mean, it's difficult to say research, given that, vampires, we are saying, are not real. But how much did you take from actual legend, and how much did you make up?
Well, we did do a lot of research into existing legends, and we took a lot of things from them. We took the idea that they have to survive on human blood, and then we made it transubstantiated wine, which is supposed to be human blood and the blood of Christ. They are allergic to silver, which comes from the history books. We both decided garlic was not going to be particularly useful. But holy objects do not necessarily repel them, but holy ground and holy objects do weaken them. So that also comes from the existing mythology of vampires.
Which is interesting. And I mean, the blood thing is fascinating. Of course, probably the scariest thing about the vampire myth is the fact that they drink your blood and, and then you die. But it's almost not that you die, it's that they drink your blood, which is kind of gross. But talk a bit more about the transubstantiation idea and the way you've twisted the drinking blood, and that makes the difference between the Strigoi and the priest, the Sanguines.
So the idea was, and this was Jim's idea, this was something that he had from the very beginning, and when he brought the idea to me, he was like, he pitched that one line, and I said, okay, I'm in. I can see where you can do really fascinating things based on that. And I remember in college, I had studied transubstantiation, and when we were studying Catholicism, and I was just amazed at this belief that during Mass, that the wine turns into the blood of Christ, and that people had wars over that. That this wasn't just a story, that this was a deeply held belief that people were willing to kill and die for. And why did it have that kind of power, and what did that mean? And what was that for? I mean, when you think about it, it's very gruesome. Telling people to drink your blood and eat your body, that's odd. That's not something that you see in other contexts where that's ever seen as a good thing, except for warriors might eat their enemy's body, but that's rare, and it's a very specialized kind of moment. And so, which Mass, of course, in transubstantiation is too. So the idea that it really does turn into blood. It isn't, doesn't represent the blood of Christ. It is the blood of Christ. And what if the reason for that were to help Strigoi find salvation? And then when you go from there, then you have all these other questions, such as, what does it mean when they drink it? Is it as good as human blood? And the answer, of course, had to be no, because they're damned and it's holy. So it's sustaining them, but it's weakening them, and it's punishing them even while it gives them this hope of salvation. And so it's a very kind of complicated idea that has so many cool ways you can go with it. And of course, it means that we could have Rune, who was a fairly innocent vampire, or Strigoi, throughout most of the series, where he hadn't taken human life, and where he was more innocent than other Strigoi.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. And then, of course, you mentioned Elizabeth Bathory and the Blood Countess. Do you want to just talk a bit more about her? Because historically, not a nice character, and yet you make her almost likable.
Well, I wouldn't want her to babysit. But historically, if you read some of the stuff that's written about her, of course, she was a very evil woman. I got a collection of letters that I found in a book, and they'd been translated from Hungarian into English, and they were the letters written by her son-in-law to her daughter and to his friends, and they detailed what he found when they went for her, when they went to arrest her, because she was quite wealthy and a member of the nobility, and so they couldn't just have her arrested. And there had been complaints from her local priest for years that women were disappearing at a very high rate when they went into her service. And initially, when he was sending letters back to Rome, he was saying things like, well, I'm not sure. They said it was cholera, but it just seems odd that the cholera was only killing her ladies' maids. And what does that mean? And so reading about it, it was just horrifying. But then there's other accounts that indicate that maybe she was framed, that perhaps she didn't do any of that, and she was just framed because the king owed her a lot of money, and like more money than he had. And he was one of the wealthiest families and individuals at the time. So when he accused her of that, he was able to strip her of her lands and her wealth and wipe out his own debt. So it was a very politically convenient time for her to be accused. And so there are some people who feel that she didn't really do as much as history paints her as doing.
Which is basically killing like 400 girls or something and bathing in their blood, right?
Yeah, but I think it was 600 women and bathing in their blood to become younger. But even the historical record where they don't talk about her killing, she was really terrible. I mean, she beat her girls. She would cut off their fingers and make them eat them. I mean, just awful, awful things. And because she was nobility and they were peasant girls and she basically owned them, nothing was done about that. And that went on for years. And it wasn't until after her husband died and she ran a school for noble women. And so families would send their daughters to her to learn how to be better nobility. And so once she started killing them, but she killed several of them, like, I don't know, 12 or 14. Then, over a period of just a few years, like 5 years or something, then they stepped in. But it wasn't until she started killing people that they thought mattered that they stepped in. So it's tough to say, was she guilty, was she not? But I like the idea of having a character in there who really was not so conflicted about being evil. So, Rune feels terrible that he's a Strigoi, and he's lost his soul, and he's trying to atone for hundreds of years. And Elizabeth's like, okay, well, not my fault, gonna have some fun. And that was kind of how she just went through it, figuring out, okay, what's best for Elizabeth, do that thing. And then she met Tommy, and she kind of softened, and she became his protector in the book. But it was a tremendous fun having a character who really didn't answer to anybody. You knew Elizabeth was going to do what was best for Elizabeth, and that was that.
Yeah. No, she's a great character. And then another of the sort of traits is the being burned by sunlight.
Yes, we did that.
And you have an interesting bit in Blood Infernal, the last one, where you use sunlight to drive the darkness into this diamond thing, which I thought was an interesting use of the light there. But I'm interested in, do you think that sunlight versus vampire, do you think it's just like a light versus darkness basic idea, or do you think there's more than that, like the power of the sunlight?
Well, I think some of it is just light versus darkness, and the idea that there are two sides to every coin, and that if you have an angel, you have to have a devil. But I think some of it is also, we're afraid of the dark. And I think we've been afraid of the dark for a long time. And there are monsters in the dark. There are wolves and there are bears. And if you go out and you stray into the forest and off the path, you did die. I mean, it wasn't just that they were these metaphorical monsters that we create on television now. There really were animals that would kill you in the forest at night. And so making a mythology out of them, I think, was a natural thing to do and happened all over the world. And so I think there's something about that unknown, that thing that you can't see because it's dark, that scares us, and that we want to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the long life, of course, it's virtual immortality. It's not actual immortality, is it? It's just a very long life.
Well, I don't know, because Lazarus is still around, and he's been around for a couple thousand years. So I don't know.
Yeah, you should probably explain the Lazarus thing for people who might not have read the books.
Okay, so in the first book, this is now a spoiler alert, and I'm going to hold my hands up, and when I'm done with the spoiler,
it's not really a spoiler.
I'll put my hands down, and then you can listen again. So in the first book, spoiler alert, Lazarus is the founding member of the Order of the Sanguines. So when he is turned into a Strigoi, and he's the first Strigoi that Jesus turns into a Sanguinus, and he founds this order that survives within the Vatican of priests who are also Strigoi. Spoiler done.
But yes, so some of them have this long life and they're still alive but not moving very much, kind of just, hanging out, going a bit slowly, and, kind of old age vampires, thousands of years old.
Yeah, well, I think there's an old age home for the older vampires where they can go and live a life of prayer and meditation, where I think they've turned away from the world above because they're tired of it, because they want to just take a step back. And some of them go and they stay down there for hundreds of years, and some of them go and they stay down there for a while. And Rune toys with it from the beginning of the very first book. He's thinking about going into seclusion and leaving behind the trappings of the everyday world.
Which is nice. So you give these vampires, basically, they're still humans. They've still got human characteristics in that way, and some kind of conscience, I guess. And it's interesting, talking about that and the conscience and the suffering. We both watched Dracula Untold, didn't we?
Yes.
which was a good movie. And again, I guess partial. Well, no, he has to make a choice. He doesn't have to become a vampire, but he has to make a choice whether to save his son and his family, in order to do this. So do you think that kind of choice is really important to make vampires we care about?
I think that it's tough to sympathize with the vampire when they are purely evil. So if you look at the original Dracula, we don't sympathize with the monster. We don't know how he became a monster, I don't think. And we don't know much about his day-to-day life or what his hopes or fears are. And we sympathize with Mina Murray and with Jonathan Harker and with Van Helsing and with Lucy and with the human side. But the monsters are monsters, and that's kind of taken as a given. And I think it's very hard to make those monsters likable unless they have something that we can understand or sympathize with. I think that's one of the things that Anne Rice did that was so genius in creating Lestat. Is, he is this vampire and he is horrible. He has terrible, terrible things, but you can't help but like him because he's very much aware of it, and he's been pushed into this circumstance. Once again, he had no choice, and he's trying to, get through it however he can.
And in that film, though, very cool was when he kind of swoops off and turns into a load of bats. Did you like that?
So that was very cool. And then the bats just come pelting down, and they just go zooming through, and everything breaks around. And I think one of the nice things about living in this day and age is that CGI has finally reached the point where they can make very good monsters on
Oh,
screen.
yeah. Yeah.
So a lot of things that, like Smog in Lord of the Rings, there's just these, well, in The Hobbit, there's just these monsters that couldn't really exist before, and now they look completely realistic. And yeah, how could you have done that before? I guess you would have had to try to hand draw bats on the.
Yeah, well, you just couldn't, but it's really awesome, and I like that. But of course, that takes away from the kind of human aspect. But the other kind of non-human, and the other thing, and the Dracula they had on TV with Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, who I find devastatingly attractive. He's always really hunky, isn't he? In these films now, hot Dracula. But Jonathan Rhys-Meyers, hot Dracula. The opening sequence. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
Yeah, in the opening, he's like, his body is rotted and stuck with a stake, and he comes alive. And the same in that Dracula Untold, he's burned almost to a crisp. He's almost disappeared from the sun, but yet they bring him back. So, here's a fantastical question. How much would there need to be left of the vampire's body, do you think, so that they could resurrect it with a load of blood?
I think it would depend on the power of the vampire before they were burned. So in Dracula Untold, he is the second vampire ever made. So he has a tremendous, tremendous amount of power. And so he is very tough to be killed. But I think when you get to the point where there's hundreds of vampires running around, then each individual vampire is wimpier because they have to be. You can't have, 10,000 all-powerful beings on Earth at the same time because they, wipe each other out.
That's a good point. So is that why we really only know the name of a couple of vampires, because most of them are just second rate?
Well, I wouldn't call them second rate to their face.
So if you had to meet Jonathan Rhys-Meyers Dracula versus Dracula Untold, hot Dracula,
Okay.
versus, well, so your characters are all kind of nice. Did you ever Rune? I didn't picture Rune as being that particularly hot. Did you have an actor in mind for Rune or the Man of Action?
Well, I mean, no, but I think if Jordan would be somebody, like Channing Tatum, some kind of
hunky,
big, hunky, all-American guy who, looks good in his
action suit.
In his action suit, and runs around and has the strength and the actual size, the brute force size to do the things that he needs to do. And Rune is like a smaller, more slender guy, because of course when Rune was growing up, people were smaller, and so he was more. I kind of viewed him as, what's his name? That actor from The Seventh Son, Ben Barnes. So that action hero with the dark hair and the dark eyes, who's a little more haunted and not as bulky as, say, Jordan, but stronger and more powerful.
Yeah. Did you have any other people in mind for any of the other characters? I always like to pick people for my films. My films? My books.
There you go.
For my films, yeah. No, for my books.
I pick directors, actors, set designers. I have cinematographers. I do have cinematographers.
I think we both want Guillermo del Toro, don't we?
We do. Oh, God, yes. Guillermo del Toro would do such a wonderful job. He could do any of my books.
Yeah, any of mine too.
That don't have any supernatural effects at all. I haven't loved him since I saw Kronos, which was that first movie he made.
Yeah.
You ever seen it?
No, I think it's Pan's Labyrinth was the first one I saw. And then Hellboy, of course, which I love.
Oh, you should totally see Kronos. It's a vampire movie, and he made it while he was working on TV in Mexico. And so he filmed it over a long period of time on a fairly small budget. But it doesn't look schlocky at all. It's very well put together and very interesting. And on the DVD extras, he he talks about the artistic decisions he made as a director and what he was doing, and I find that fascinating because often, on the special features they'll just talk about, this was the day of shooting and I was throwing up and then this bee hit me in the eye, and all this anecdotal thing, whereas he'll be like, well, here's the color palette when I was making this device and I had this idea of why it would function this way and I wanted this to look like it. And you learn a lot as an artist when you listen to him talk about it, and particularly Kronos, because that was his first film and it was his breakout film. And it's a very fascinating vampire film because, once again, it's a completely different take on the vampire tale. So the vampires in his movie are like nothing else that we've ever seen before.
Oh, cool. And then, of course, he came back to do The Strain. So,
Yeah, and the strain is their vampires are bad. They're evil.
yeah, and they have like a sucker thing, which is quite odd. They're like almost like aliens. They don't have fangs. They have sucker things.
Ah, well, that would make sense. I mean,
And then it's like a gulping sucker thing. It's really gross. But
ew, ew.
anyway, grossing everyone out.
They have fangs. No, they don't. They don't have fangs. They don't have fangs at all. They just eat blood. And there's one scene where this old man is turning into a vampire, and he wants to drink blood, and he goes into this bathroom to kind of recover. And this man comes in with a bloody nose, and he bleeds on. It's this beautiful marble bathroom, and he bleeds on the counter and wipes some of it off, but not off all of it. And he leaves, and then there's the old man alone in the room with the blood, and is the most just creepy scene I've ever seen in my life. And it's really just an old man in a bathroom, but you're just horrified, and you're horrified with him, and you're horrified of him, and you're horrified for him. And it's a wonderful movie. It's a love story, and it's just, I mean, it's just incredible. And the cinematography is, you can see everything Guillermo del Toro will become in that movie because it's just masterful right out of the gate.
Well, that clearly affected you, and it came out in the Sanguine series.
It did. It was one of my. It may be my favorite vampire movie. Period.
Ah, there you go. Okay, so where can people find the Sanguine series and your other books?
Well, the Order of the Sanguines series is a trilogy, and they are The Blood Gospel, Innocent Blood, and Blood Infernal. And they should be available anywhere where books are sold. They'll have them at your local bookstore. They'll have them at Amazon. They're in audiobook. They've been translated into, I don't even know, 10 or 12 languages. And they run a little behind in translation. So they're a year later in most countries. But you can find them anywhere. And then the Joe Tesla series, there's 2 of those now. There's The World Beneath and The Tesla Legacy. And those are available online, or you can order them at your local bookstore as well. So there's a paperback version and an audio version coming out next spring and a couple months, and of course an ebook version.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for your time, Becky. That was fun.
Yeah, it was.